Hi, this is Nick from Vire Engines. Just going to do a video today as quickly as I can. I'm sorry if this is getting long. You've got the tillotson carburetor on all the Vire 7s and nearly all of the Vire 6s. And you need to do a service on this carburetor at least every 4 years, maximum 10. Now, if you saw my other video, I showed you how to change just the diaphragm inside. This is the part that will stiffen up, and it needs to be supple and like a lovely bit of rubber like this new one. Otherwise it doesn't properly regulate the fuel level in the carb, and that's a separate job. But I'm going to show you in this video how to fit the whole repair kit, which includes all of the gaskets and the fuel valve, and even if you need to service the little closed off cap, which is the mixing area for the idle starting jets in case they're blocked. So before I go on, I just want to generalize here. You've got options on my site. You can either buy a brand new carburetor, obviously it's got a new kit in there, and all of those carburetors are tested and initially set by me, or you can get one of these refurbished carburetors which has had the whole service kit put in by me. And not only that, they're tested on a real engine to make sure that there's no leaks, it runs nicely, it starts nicely, and all of the functions operate as they should. And those are about £100 cheaper. Or you can decide in this video with my help that you are going to not just replace the diaphragm, you're going to service the whole carb. So I've made a start on this by loosening the screws to save you time watching, but if you're not just getting the diaphragm, if you get a repair kit from me, what is it going to include? Well, I've laid one out here and I'll zoom in so you can see, and I'll explain the sequence of what you're getting. So basically inside that carburetor there are 1, 2, 3, 4 gaskets, a metering diaphragm, the fuel pump diaphragm and valves combined in one piece now, and you also get the fuel cut-off valve, the seat, the needle, the lever, and the washer, which is underneath the seat. And then you get this little disc, which is about 10mm, and you need to very carefully drill and lever out the old disc if you need to get underneath the idle jets to clean that out. And then this gets pressed in with a punch, and as it flattens it expands and seals the hole again. That's why you get that. It don't normally fit it, and it's a real fiddle. Finally, you get the gasket between the carburetor and the cylinder or its bracket, which you may need. So that's what you get in the kit. I'd just like to point out the things you don't get in the kit. You do not get a main jet, and one of the problems with these carburetors, which I see in about 30% of the time, is although you can see down the throat of this one, if you focus there, just when that valve opens, possibly you won't see it in this light, there's 3 tiny holes on the cylinder side for the starting jets, but on the other side, if I open up the choke on this one, you'll see down here a little dimple, not this tube, a little dimple. That's the main jet. Now inside there you can see this brass if you look carefully, but inside that jet there is a plastic ball like a snorkel valve, and if those get contaminated and are no longer circular, it keeps drying out, and instead of atomizing the mixture under full throttle, half throttle conditions, you get globules of fuel out instead, and that is something you cannot change just with a service kit. So I'd just like to point out, if you get a refurbished carburetor from me like this one, I have tested the main jet, and I may have replaced it if necessary. It's going to be working fully. If you get a repair kit, the one thing you don't get in there is the main jet, and the reason for that is it's extremely difficult dealer only change procedure inside this carb. So you get the things which go wrong commonly in this kit. You don't get the things which rarely go wrong, which are nearly impossible to change. Okay, so I'm going to now zoom back down here and take this carb apart quickly. So this has been unbolted from the engine. You need to do that because you can't get to these screws from underneath. The engine's in the way. So I suggest you do first is pull off the crankcase pipe which goes to the fuel pump diaphragm. Then get a flat bladed short screwdriver, open the throttle like this, and that will tilt the lever, exposing the screw underneath. You can undo the screw and then your lever will slide off. You can leave it on the engine connected to the Morse, no problem at all. And what's even better, with that removed, you can much easier get the 10mm spanner in to undo this nut and this one, and then flick them off on your fingers. You've already got under the engine a rag to catch the nuts and bits and pieces and loosen it off. Take off your fuel pipe, take off your choke control cable or wire, and then you've got this loose. Then what you want to do is turn it upside down, and either in your hand carefully on a rag, or what I've done here, I've put a rag in the vise and I've turned this choke off so it won't get hurt when I put it in the vise lightly. I'm not doing this uptight, but it allows me to work in this upside down, which is where most of the work are. Now, as I say, those are the new parts. That's a refurbished carburetor. That's the kit which I've laid out here. What tools are you going to need? So if you look over to my tools here, I'll show you what I use. So the first thing you're going to want is to loosen the let's see him back out. Right. So the first tool you're going to want to do is to loosen this central screw which holds the fuel inlet cover down, and the reason that you do that first is because it may be stiff and it's easy to do while this is held in your hand or the vise, and depending on the position of this that can turn all the way around, it may well be obstructing one of the 6 screws you need to get out. So a large flat bladed screwdriver, take that out and you remove the fuel cover and screw. There we are, I'll put that down here. And the next tool you're going to need is a screwdriver with either a flat bit which is medium size to fit these screws, there's 6 of them, or on the later carburetors it's a star shaped thing, it's a T20. Okay, so one of those 2 bits in your screwdriver, and basically this one has got the slotted screws. So you take these screws out, there's 6 screws, we'll lay them out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Obviously I loosened these earlier just to save you guys time. And then the next things which were under that fuel cover is the cork gasket. You won't need that because you get a new one here. So this old cork gasket can be discarded and the new one will be used. Then you have this wire gauze. I'll just tickle that out with something. You don't want to bend this. This is to stop big particles of grit. You don't get that in the kit because you can flush it out either with petrol or carb cleaner, which I find faster. And then make sure before you get it in, check all the way around that it's clean. So keep that. Okay, and then you can lift off the fuel cover, as we call it. That's one piece. Put that down. Next you have the pump diaphragm and valves. Now this is the older style one, and what they did in the early days is they had two different gaskets here, and you'll see that one was the diaphragm and valves and one is the spacer gasket. You get the spacer gasket, you get the valves, so you can discard this. Then I'd just like to point out, in the new kits, the valves and the diaphragm are one piece. So you may have used two pieces before and the spacer gasket, but you can throw that away. So next we have the middle cover, which is where the crankcase pressure pipe came from, which drives the fuel pump. That comes off clean. Obviously we're going to decontaminate these parts before rebuilding it. Then you can peel off your old diaphragm. I ripped this one off earlier, but usually these are a bit stiff from age, and that's a key part to replace, so you can throw that away. And then finally here we have the spacer gasket, and you only need to remove this if you are changing the fuel control valve or cleaning up this surface to decontaminate it. But if you're leaving the fuel valve in, which is quite tricky, you can leave that in situation, but you get a new one, so throw that away. Okay, now I'm going to continue the disassembly here. The special tool that you'll need if you want to change this main fuel valve, which stops it flooding if it's faulty or preventing the fuel. This has got an 8mm hex head and an 8mm socket fits, but I found it won't go past the casting here, your socket, unless you reduce the diameter. So I reduced the diameter of my socket on the grinding wheel years ago, and this fits. If you haven't got this, you cannot change the shut-off valve for the fuel, but it very rarely goes wrong anyway. Most people, I think, don't bother, but I'll show you how to do it. Okay, now the only other tools I've got is carb cleaner, which is great for flushing all of the bits and pieces out. Having decontaminated, you probably made granules of salt and aluminium and gasket, so this will flush it away outside and in. And I've got a bit of marine grease, so after I've cleaned up things like these bolts on the wire wheel, I'll just smear a bit of grease on the threads before I put them back on, make sure that nobody's going to have a problem in future. And you might find that a Dremel with I've got a steel filament wheel here, which is great for getting in orifices and cleaning out any oxides you find. So if you're cleaning out, for instance, this area of the of all these contaminants, that's ideal for that. And then once you've cleaned it out with the wheel, you can scratch any little bits out with a screwdriver that the reel can't reach, and then finally flush it with the carb cleaner. So that's the way to clean up these parts. Just a word of warning here, don't be too rough or use sandpaper on these ever, because if you're too rough, these little, you see these fine lines? They're actually where it seals the gasket. So if you take those off by polishing too hard, the gaskets won't seal fuel or airtight properly, and you may get performance issues or leaks. So when you're cleaning this up, just use a wire wheel in a light method at best. Okay, so that's how to do that. I'll show you how to change this fuel valve and Welsh plug, which are actually quite difficult. So don't be put off if you could just skip this bit if you are wanting to change it with all the gaskets and you don't want to change these two particular bits. Now what I'm talking about here, this is the Welsh plug, okay, and is a little metal cover which covers a pocket. Underneath that is the three holes which make the idle and starting jets, feeds it with fuel. If those are blocked, this needs to come out, and then you can poke through with a thin piece of wire those jets and finally refit the new Welsh plug in there. So it's very unusual. I'll tell you how to diagnose if you need to do this now. What you need to do is get the carburettor in your hand like this. Turn the choke open, and then the throttle needs to be held with your hand. Now I'm going to get a torch. I use magnifying glasses, so here's my torch, and I will light up the throat. I'm hoping if I get in there and this thing focuses, at the bottom there, just where the flap meets the floor, there are in fact 3 little holes. They're about 0.5 millimeters, and you can't really see them here, but that's where the fuel comes out. So the way to test these are working is to simulate the carburetor working. Take out the slow mix adjuster screw with its O-ring complete, so you don't want to drop that on the floor. Put that carefully down. Get your carb cleaner. Okay, I'm going to zoom out a little bit here, and you need to squirt this into the hole where the adjuster was. Okay, now I can't hold the torch at the same time, but I have got a head torch. Let me get that on. Oh, advances in technology here, right. So hopefully, is that the right one? Here we go, right. Head torch on. Remember, we are checking to see if this has got blocked idle jets. So with my left finger, I'm holding the throttle fully open. Underneath here is a little hole that's worth blocking with your thumb. Not vital, but it increases the pressure. And then I'm squirting in the side all at the same time. I'm looking to see these 3 jets. 1, 2, 3. Now you can see that fluid going up. And you can't see it on this video, but what you need to see is there's 1, 2 jets going vertically upwards, and the one furthest away is going back at 45 degrees. So you can have 3 squirts of fluid you should be able to see. 1, 2 and 3. If you can't see 3, then you need to either put a bit of wire down here to clean them out and continually do this until it's working, or it could be that there's some dirt inside the mixing area for those 3 jets, which is covered by this Welsh plug. Now I'm going to show you how to drill it out now, and we'll check it. But yeah, this is actually working fine, this carb, but let's pretend it isn't. So let's get this in the vise. How do you get that Welsh plug out? Well, what you need to do is you need to drill it or punch it to a maximum depth of about 2 millimeters below this mixing chamber. I've got a carb here where I've had it removed before, and when you have drilled it, you'll see underneath this area is not very deep at all. There's a screwdriver, and there isn't really much depth in there, but inside there you can see the holes. Now this carburetor I threw away because I discovered that some idiot had drilled through these holes too big and it would never idle, so this is scrap. But I'm showing you, after you've taken this out, this is what you'll have, this little cavity, and then you can clean the cavity of all the salt, and you can poke through with a small piece of wire, like this piece of wire. Where are we? There we go. And you'll be able to poke through all of the 3 holes which are revealed under this cap, including the one which goes backwards, and there we go, it goes through. That is the way of clearing. I'll tell you the diameter of this wire I'm using. my calipers gone? No, I won't put my calipers down somewhere. But it's quite thin, it's about 0.5. You could use some fuse wire, or you could use the strand of wire from a wire brush. So if you've got a wire brush like this, you can get a pair of pliers and pull out one of these filaments, straighten it a bit, and that will be good enough. Or I've used guitar strings in the past. So let's get this underway. I'm just going to pause while I get the tool set up. Okay, so what I've chosen to do this time, I've got a small drill which is about 2-3 millimeter diameter, and so that I can see how deep it's penetrated, what I've done here is I've put a piece of PVC tape on, and then as it sinks down into the hole I can stop before I go too far, because underneath this steel plate is an aluminium carburetor. If I allow the drill to slip down, it will make a real mess of the carb. It could ruin it, so I'm going to be careful not to go deeper than more than a couple of millimeters. That's the purpose of this red tape. Once I've drilled a small circular hole, I can use something like a small screwdriver and just tap that in with a hammer, and it will enlarge that round hole to a rectangular one, and then you can lever it out. Or alternatively, you could get a nail if you haven't got a drill, and you can sharpen the tip of that nail if it's not sharp and drive it in about halfway the tip, and that will make a hole instead of a drill. But I've got a drill here today, so let's use that. Right, so basically I'll start in the centre, get myself down low, and I'm bracing my hand so I can control the depth. A nice sharp drill, you don't want to use a blunt drill. There we are, it's gone. So that's got a nice round hole in it. I don't need that drill anymore. And I've got a flat screwdriver here. I'm just going to tap that in. It's slightly wider than the hole. So that's now stuck in. And maybe first go or other goes, I can lever that out. There you go, it came first go. So I've levered this out. This will get discarded. This is your old piece. There you go. And I'm just going to basically take that off. That's really no use at all. The only thing you could do if you had to reuse this is use some epoxy to put it back in. But if you've bought the service kit, you've got a brand new one, so this is getting thrown away. I've never reused one in my life, by the way. But I guess if you were stuck on a boat, you have to consider all sorts of different ideas. Now, I can see the cavity is now exposed. It's a pretty good carburetor here. And if you look, I'll show you the 3 holes and the directions. So if there was any salt in here, you'd want to flush it out and use carb cleaner to do that. But I've got my wire. This is the hole which is closest to the cylinder. So you would rod through there, wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. This is the hole which is the next one. So those will squirt fuel out vertically upwards. And then the one which is hard to see, if you tilt it back here, you can just see this hole here. And this goes 45 degrees backwards. If I open the throttle, you can probably see my wire. I don't know. Coming through. There it is. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. And that one goes 45, and then the 2 up. So once we've cleaned those out, all we need to do is blow carb cleaner in these 2 orifices and then replace the cap. So I'm just going to do that quickly. So where's my carb cleaner? There it is. Right, carb cleaner here. In the jet. That's all clean. Right, there's no swarf from my drilling. That's important. I don't want any swarf inside that cavity before I cover it. So let's put this back in the vise, or your hand if that's what you were doing. And then we'll get the new Welsh plug, okay, which came in the kit I showed you earlier. Right, and this is going to squash tight. So what you do is you put this with the domed side up, yeah. Drop it in. You don't want any swarf, and you'll find that's a nice loose fit. Drops in there, okay. And then to finish it off, you need to use a punch, and this is a suitable punch. So it's got a nice flattened end. You could use that end actually, doesn't really matter. But what you want to do is make sure this is seated down and position the punch in the center, and then tap away until you've sunk down the center about 1 millimeter. That's it. And that has spread as the center came down. It spreads the outside and seals it pretty much airtight, petrol tight forever. You can see that won't drop out. So that is how to service your 3 starting and idling jets if they're blocked. Now I'm going to show you how to change the fuel cut-off valve and set the lever. So we will zoom in a little bit. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is undo this screw which holds the pin down. It's a flat screwdriver. It's important to get a screwdriver that's a good fit in the screw. If you've got the wrong size tip, you can ruin the top of that screw, and then you are in a real painful place. You may have to use an impact driver or something to get it out. So don't break off that screw head. Use the correct screwdriver. Quite a lot of downward force, and there we go. Now you don't need to take it out 100%. Just about 2 turns and it will release the pin far enough for you to get it. You mustn't allow the spring to fly across your workshop, okay? But if you just get this loose, then you can pull this axle out, disengage it from the jet, and keep these bits together, okay, because you don't get that pin in the new kit. You can throw away this old lever, because you do get that in the new kit, and then this spring you need to keep, okay, keep that careful, and the needle, which I can pull out using the old lever, that is thrown away. You get a new one of those. And finally you've got the screwed in jet. Now, as I said before, you need an 8mm bit which is narrowed at the end to get this out, and it just clears the casting if you've narrowed it, and it's not in too tight, and basically that will come out pretty easily. There we go. So that's undone it, and you can pull out this. I've got a pair of tweezers here somewhere which I will use, and that comes out. So that is your jet. You'll see inside there is in this one's green, but that is actually a rubber seal, and sometimes they get damaged, which is why that they won't seal perfectly and leak. So the needle goes down there into that hole, sits on the rubber seal. This is why you might want to change this if you've had fuel leaking when you've left the boat, or that may get sticky and it won't open. So if you've got difficulty starting after leaving the boat for months or you've got a leaking carb, that could be the problem. So let's throw that away, and then deep down in this hole you'll see there is the copper washer, which is under there in here. So I'm just going to tickle that out. You can tap it out sometimes. I'm going to use the tweezers. That seems to be loose now. So I'm going to tap that out. There she is. You see the little copper washer. So that can be thrown away as well. Okay, so before I put this together, I'm just going to rinse with carb cleaner around these holes because I don't want any rubbish dropping in that seal. And through pumping through this hole, we'll spray any fuel and residue trapped in there. So that's all clean. Back in the vise we go, and I'm now going to put the new parts in this carburetor. So first of all we have the new copper washer. Drop that in. If it's not sitting flat, you need to line it up now, because if you screw the brass seat in, it could bend that. So I'm now made sure that's flat. Now we're going to put the new seat in. You see this one, it changed the colour. It's not green now, it's purple. It doesn't matter, but that's a brand new one. Drop that in, and we've got our 8mm socket. That gets screwed down. That's it. Yes, almost no pressure to tighten these. I don't know what torque it is, but it's almost nothing. So just a little pull on there is enough to seal it to the washer, and it couldn't vibrate out. So that is now done. Next we have the new needle, which goes in with the pointed side down. Just drop that in. Next we have the spring, which you kept safe. That drops in the hole. Just, it might be nice for me to zoom in here for you. Okay. Yeah. Right, there you go. Now, next you have the axle, which you kept safe, and the seesaw. Now, if you look at this, there's a dimple on the seesaw here. That needs to go down because it engages in the spring. So push your axle through, nice loose fit, and you need to do two things simultaneously. You need to engage this in the needle in the forked end, and you need the dimple to engage in the spring. So a bit of manoeuvring here, and I'll check I've got both happy. Yeah, so I've got the dimple in the spring and the fork around the needle. I can then push my axle through so it lies under that screw, hold it down with my finger, and simply tighten the screw. So the screw only needs to be tight enough that it won't shake out. Okay, so I'm putting that down till it gets firm, and then about a 1/16 of a turn, that's fine. Now we need to check the levelling of the lever, and what I use is the edge of a Stanley blade. So I'll put that down earlier. There's one here. Right, so you've got a Stanley blade, you've got a short edge here. It's ideal, nice flat edge for checking that. Now if you look there, you can see that that lever is not level at all, so it needs bending. So what you do, and I'm talking about this position here, so So we bend this up until it's about level. Give it some exercise. Oh, what's going on here? No, that's incorrect. That's too stiff to operate. What's going on here then? So, there's something wrong here. Let me loosen that fulcrum screw. This should be easy up and down. No, it's not that. So why is this? I think this is a bit wider than the original. It's a bit odd. Let's use the original. Okay. I'm not happy with this seesaw. Let's take it out. You're probably thinking to yourself, I'm going to get the expert to do this because I wouldn't have spotted that. Well, I don't blame you. So I'm disengage the needle, disengage the spring. I'll put that down for 1 minute. Let's use the old one. There's nothing really wrong with the old one. I wonder sometimes why they give you a new one. Okay, let's put that in. I've got to engage it in the top of the needle. Check the spring is on the dimple. And now tighten the screw that retains the axle. It's fine. Now that's working much better. For some reason that kit had a slightly wider axle when it was binding on the casting, but it doesn't matter, you're always going to be able to reuse your old one. So now just jostling this around, I'll check the level. I can see a little bit of light under there, I think you can too, so that's too low. So bend it up till it's level. Check again after a jostle, about a millimetre away. If you bend it too high, you have to hold this end down and push the seesaw down the other way. It's pretty obvious. Jostle, jostle, recheck. Now that's absolutely bang on now. There's dead level I can see with this straight edge. So that's all set perfectly. We've done the Welsh plug, we've done the fuel control valve. All we need to do now is reassemble this carburetor with the new gaskets. So the sequence is, let's zoom out for you. Okay, the sequence is, first of all, you have the circular above, then you only go on one way and line up with the holes. I've got that upside down, so it's illogical. That's all lined up now. Now you have your metering diaphragm, which a dimple is going to operate on this lever, so it has to be that way round obviously. Again, make sure these 3 pins are coming up through the gaskets. It's all the holes are clear, it won't get damaged. Then you are going to have your middle plates, but this is dirty, so I'm going to clean this up and I'll pause it while I do that. Okay, so back again. Basically what I've just done is I've got my wire wheels and carb cleaners, and I've got rid of all of the contaminants like oxides and salts out of these castings, both the middle casting and the fuel cover casting, and I've also rinsed any particles out of the mesh strainer. So now we can complete our assembly sequence. So as I showed you, you've got the distance gasket first, and then you have the diaphragm with the dimple facing towards the lever. Make sure all the pins come through. Then you have the middle piece, and that goes on. I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I like to put a little bit of grease in here. I'll tell you why. Because you get the crankcase air in here and you don't get fuel in that cavity, and I've sometimes found crystals in there from corrosion, so that's going to stop it. Now next we have the gasket, which goes over these little ridges. You'll find there's only one way up it'll go, and it's a queer shape, but it leaves a circling hole in the middle for the diaphragm. Then we have the valves and the diaphragm itself. The valves are on this side, so that will be correct. This big notch down the forward side of the carburetor is on all the gaskets, so it's quite easy to line these up. Just look for the 3 pinholes, okay, and then you fit, and I've cleaned this up too of course, your fuel cover, they call this, and this goes on. Make sure that's all nice, and then you're going to put your 3 screws back in. But these are a bit rusty, so I'm going to clean these up, and I'll just pause it, hang on. Right, I've cleaned these screws up to my satisfaction now. Basically, it had particles of salt or something on them, so I've just done that on the wire wheel. You don't have to do that. I just don't like anything dirty anywhere near a carburetor I've worked on. So in those 6 screws go, and I always put a little bit of marine grease on the threads. I can't help it, I just like to do a good job, and this is why these videos are so long. I do is because I can't do the minimum, I have to do something special. So those 6 go in, okay, and also while I was there I cleaned up the adjuster. I took this spring off, cleaned all the rubbish underneath it, and put some fresh white grease on. Remember that there's a little washer and a O-ring which faces a certain direction for the adjuster. I won't put those in a minute because I'm going to flush it. And this is the fast mix adjuster. I've done the same there. The O-ring is still in the carb on this one, but you want to take those out. So now we're going to screw this carb together evenly around. It's nice to do, and I'm quite pleased with this. It looks good. Of course, the proof of the pudding is testing it on the engine, and when I refurb these carbs I never send them out just rebuilt with crossed fingers. I put them on a known good engine where I've just had a good carb running, and I know by ear and sound and feel exactly how this should start and run, and I know if there's any slight imperfection immediately. So hopefully you can do that. I'm just going to change the bit of the screwdriver to something a little bit better, because I don't want to start putting torque on these screw heads with the wrong size bit and damage them. It's always my philosophy that it's not just about the way that you do something, you've got to think of the next person, and if you leave a carburetor unserviceable because you wrecked one of the heads, that's no good for the next guy. So those are all evenly tight. I also rinsed this gauze out, and that now sits in. You'll see that there's a little place for it, and now we have our cork gasket, and we have our fuel strainer. This one is a bit distorted, so to be honest with you, I'm going to fit a new one. You can't get this, but I wouldn't want to send this carb out with a dodgy one, so I've got a brand new thing. This does not come with the kit. Presumably your bottom fitting is okay, but I'm going to replace that because I want to sell this carb as a refurbished one later. So that goes down, and you know, this can go in a variety of positions. It's your choice, but I find the best position generally is between these 2 screws facing slightly forward, and that will give you a maximum fit for your, if you've got rubber pipe going on here, without being obstructed by the screws. And you may have a Jubilee clip, you want all the room you can get, so don't go crazy on this. You may need to loosen that and swivel it when it's fitted to the engine in case that's not the right position. Incidentally, the a lot of the carburetors don't have that on the bottom. They will instead have a threaded fitting like this, which is the same, it's just aluminium, and it's for old-fashioned threaded fuel hoses. Now if you're replacing that, that's fine if you're keeping your old-fashioned threads, but if you get a refurbished carb from me, it will have one of these. So you can just undo that screw and change it over to what you've got that suits your boat. Or my advice is throw this away if you've got one of these pipe fittings. The reason that they fitted these was back in the 60s and 70s they didn't have fuel resistant fuel rubber hose, and now they do. So they used to put copper fuel lines in the boat and threaded fittings in case there was a fire. They wouldn't melt through. But the trouble is that those copper fuel lines oxidize and they contaminate inside the carburetor with copper oxide, and it's just a mess and difficult to fit. But you can buy a 2 or 3 meters of that fuel hose real cheap from a Chandler's, 6mm bore. It'll fit straight on here with a Jubilee clip, straight on the tank or your fuel filter, and it's a lot easier than these fittings that tend to corrode and get stiff. And it is fuel resistant, fire resistant fuel hose that you can buy now. So that's a variation. That's all on and together. We finished on the underside of the carb, so all I'm going to do now is flush the 2 jets with my carb cleaner. That's the idle jet, that's the main jet. I'll open the choke and check that's coming through nice. Yeah, for what I know about them, that's fine. Now I can screw the jet adjusters in. So there's the high jet one. As I say, the O-ring is actually in this, and so I didn't need to take it out with a spring. The initial setting for this is 1.5 turns out. So it screws in, and once it comes to a nice stop, you count the turns out. So half, 1, 1.5. Now you'll need to change that. It's going to be somewhere between 1 and 2 turns out, but it depends on the propeller on your boat. This high-speed mixture screw, it's got H next to it, and if you read the manual, it said when the engine's warmed up, put it in forward gear, wide open throttle, and you adjust this while the engine's running to get the maximum RPM, and you'll find that that is somewhere between 1 and 2 turns out. I don't know what kind of propeller you've got or loading on the shaft, so I set it halfway, but you might get a bit of performance improvement if you adjust it as per the manual. And then we put in the slow mixture screw. I've cleaned that up so there's no contamination on that. You can wind that in with a screwdriver, and the initial setting here, it says in the manual, is 1 turn out, but I have found in practice the perfect thing with a nice carburetor where you've checked the level of that lever and you've got a good diaphragm in, is 0.8 turns out. So as I say, you wind it in till it gets a bit of resistance, it's firm. Look at the angle of that slot and memorize it, and we will go 0.8 turns out. So first of all I do half. Okay, so that's half a turn, and then I will go up to 3/4 there, and then a little bit more is 0.8 because 3/4 is 0.75. So that is my initial settings for the carburetor. This top screw shouldn't have moved, but if it does, you will find that the setting is something like 1.5 turns from when it first starts to operate that lever. So you wind out that top screw if you're not sure. I need to clean this a bit, and once it makes contact with the lever it's going to impinge upon, which is now, then count 2 full turns, half, 1, 1.5, 2, and that will be your initial throttle setting. That's all very nice, and it makes a bit of a gap. I've got to flush this through now. So I'll just clean these orifices through with carb cleaner. Okay, so I've cleaned this all up with carb cleaner now, inside and out, and I'm happy with it. Word of caution there, with carb cleaner, it does attack the rubber parts slowly, so I wouldn't use it unless I was going to be running this carburetor with petrol in the next hour or two, which I will be. So it's something you can do in-house, but it's great for cleaning carbs, but it does attack the rubber a little bit. So now one thing I've noticed here is if you pull this screw right off, so there is a gap here, two things. If I do this lever, you see this shaft tip here, it's been bent by the previous owner. Now that may have weakened where it's thin here, so I'm going to replace this shaft. The other problem, if you look inside this orifice, you see there's a little gap at the top and there isn't a little gap at the bottom, so possibly because the shaft has been bent, but what happens there is it won't start and idle properly, because at low throttle settings you'll have a bigger gap at the top than the bottom, which means it won't be sucking the fuel out so efficiently. It'll affect the mixture. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to completely replace this shaft, and it's not difficult to do, but basically to replace the shaft, I'll zoom out now, what you do is you pull this right off, you then can remove this screw safely, you then put the shaft at 45 degrees, you having scratched a mark of where the top is on that brass circular plate, you pull it out, then you undo this screw, which can be very stiff, pull the fork out, and you can withdraw the shaft, remembering to relocate the spring when you put a new one in. So I'm going to get a new shaft now and put that in, so just pause while I do that. Okay, I've got some new shafts here in stock and I'm going to replace this. Just thought it's worth mentioning, if you want one of these, just email me, because there's a lot of parts like this I keep in stock, new or refurbished, and I haven't got time, because this would only be about £5 or £10 or something, to put all my parts online. But I try my best, and there's about 50 parts added each year, and it's a job to keep up with it all. So if you want something small, just drop me a message. I've probably got it, either new or refurbished for you. Okay, I'm going to fit this as I described, and I'll see you back in a minute. Right, okay, so I've undone that screw, I've undone the centre screw, I've scratched a little arrow on that circular thing in the upwards direction, tilt it 90 degrees, and it should wiggle out towards me, which it does. Put that down. Right, now I've removed that fork and screw. This shaft will come out. It is a bit bent, so it's not going to be straightforward. Might put up a bit of a fight, but it will come out. Maybe if I bend that straight, or snap it off, I suppose. Let's just... where's my straightening thing? Yeah. Power pliers here, pull it out. Disengage that spring. You appreciate why it takes, on average, about an hour each carburetor I refurbish. It's if you've got a good carburetor and you're just servicing it because it's due for one, you won't have to do things like this. But I get these carburetors sent to me with spare engines and things from all over the world, and they've often got a host of hidden problems. So that is trash. And they set the spring. I need to reuse that. Let's get the spring off. Yes, please. A bit of a fiddle. There we go. That's off. New shaft. Re-engage it where it was. Hope you can see that all right. Goes in between the two lumps, in fact, and that's how it sits. Okay, so now this can wiggle in back into the carb. Yep, that slides through nicely, and then you engage the spring in the hole and put that back in. You then put the fork where the reduced diameter slot is, and then you put the screw back in to the hole here, screw it up, make sure when you do this up with the correct bit to fit it that it doesn't, this shaft is nice and free, it's not got stiff. So to put a little bit of tightness on that, check that, that's still nice, and then the spring needs engaging in there fully just to be nice about it. Try this. There we go, that's completely in the hole now, that spring. So that's set perfectly. So we've got the reverse procedure now. We put the shaft at 90 degrees so that we can get this back in. Look for a little scratch mark which scratched in the up direction, and there it is. There's my arrow, so that should end up upwards, and wiggle it in, get it in the slot, and then when it gets lined up, you'll find this hole in the center is a bit misaligned, but the technique to line that up is just to snap it, and if you get it right, I've got that in too far now, it will end up perfectly centralized. There, by its own nature. And now you can get the screw in that hole very carefully back in. I'm going to drop that in. I've got a slightly magnetic tip here which helps, because I can get that screw into position, drop it in the hole, tighten it up a little bit, and once I've got that in, so I'll leave it loose and I'll give these a few snaps until it's equalized, because I want this shutting absolutely, and that's no good at the moment. You see there's a gap at the top and the bottom, and until that's right I'm not going to tighten that screw up. So I can see I need to turn this flap slightly. That's it. Right, now that's completely flat, top and bottom. I'm happy. I can tighten the screw up. Just a little bit of pressure so it can't possibly vibrate out, but you don't want to strip the thread. You could use that nylock in there if you want, and that is beautiful. Free action, and there's no air gap at the top or the bottom with this screw not touching. And now I'll just reset that screw, which you turn in until it touches. There, it's touching now, and then count in 2 turns. Half, 1, 1.5, 2 turns. That should be good for starting. I'm going to need to calibrate this. What is the exact position for this screw on your boat? The answer is you want this to have as slow and idle as possible when the engine's warmed up, without stopping when it's in gear. So put it in forward gear when the engine's warmed up, and reduce this until it's nice and slow, but it won't stall or cut out. And the reason for that is that when it's in neutral, and you push the gear lever into forward, it can burn out the clutch if the engine's revving too high. So that's my advice. Adjust this in gear as slow as possible without it stopping, and then when it's in neutral and you put it in gear, it won't endanger the clutch. So that's all set up and ready to test. Just a last note here, if you want to change this lever from the new long type to this old type, all you need to do to change it is to close the choke, take out the screw, and as I say, I would scratch a little arrow on the top so you know which way to get it back in easiest. Then turn it 90 degrees, you can pull that plate out. Once you've done that, this shaft comes out completely, but watch out because behind this hole is a ball bearing and a spring. Don't lose it. The reason that they're there is to lock it into either position so it cannot vibrate on when the engine's running. It effectively has a lock because of the hidden ball bearing and spring which is under there. So if you want to remove that shaft to change it for a different type, then that's how you do that. And the other thing is, if you have a long lever one, you can either tear that lever off or saw it off and then just fit your old choke lever if you want to. So those are just differences. I'm ready to test this. Thank you for watching, and I'll show you it on the test. Okay, so basically I've just taken that carb straight off the bench a minute ago, and I've just put the two nuts on which hold it to the cylinders with some gaskets. Normally you'd have the plate here, of course, with your remotes. So you've got the crankcase breather, the crankcase pressure hose which operates the fuel pump, and I've got my fuel pipe here, 6mm bore for this type of fitting, and you would have it secured with a Jubilee clip in the boat and thicker walled stuff, but this is just my test rig. I've got a pressure gauge on here. Now there's no fuel whatsoever in this carb, but I will show you how much fuel I put in. So I've got this priming bulb here, and if you watch this gauge, I've got fuel pretty much up to here, and it's filtered, but 1, 2, 3, and I can just hear the poppet valve going. That's showing about 8 psi, so that should be good enough. Now I could wait for fuel to dribble out of here, but I'd risk flooding the engine. I'd rather not do that. I'm quite confident there's fuel in the bottom of this carburetor now, because I heard it hiss, and we'll give this a go. So I've got this ready to go, and the initial settings are correct. So let's hit the starter button and see what happens here. I've just reduced the stick over screw. It's about 1.5 cents out now. It's running a bit slower. The mixture sounds good. I'm just going to weaken it until it stops and then double check. That's the crude way of stopping an engine if you haven't got the kill switch wired. This is just a temporary engine I got. So that's all fine, and there's no leaks. When I pressured up that to 8 psi, there's no leaks or wetness under here, so all the gaskets are good. It's running, it's now sucking up at -1 psi, so I know the pump is working perfectly. The fuel can is actually 3 feet below that carb, so that is working fantastic, the pump. And the mixture that started instantly, as you saw. That's a really good carburetor. and it had a few problems, as you saw. That'll go on my site, Refurbished Carburetor, and as I say, it's a good option. The only thing is, of course, the castings are older, so technically it might not last as long as a new carb, but it's had all that care and attention, and even a new shaft in there. So, job done. Thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, just email me, and I'll try and do some videos in future for you guys. But that's all from Nick at vireengines.com. Cheers.